Close your eyes if you'd like. You won't need them for this one. Imagine arriving somewhere large and old just as the light is failing. Not a cottage this time, not a small timber house with a single hearth and a family pressed close around it. Somewhere bigger, colder. A castle, its gray stone walls rising up out of the dusk like something that grew there, rather than something built. Its narrow windows already catching the last orange light of the sinking sun and turning it thin and pale before it ever reaches the rooms inside. You've been traveling all day. Your legs ache. The portcullis has just been raised to let your small party through, its iron teeth disappearing up into the dark of the gatehouse ceiling with a groan that seems to settle somewhere low in your chest. A servant with a torch is already leading you across the inner ward, past stables and a well and a chapel whose doors stand slightly open, toward the great hall where a fire is being built up for the evening. And beyond it, up a spiral stair, worn smooth by centuries of feet, toward the chamber where you will sleep tonight. 'Cause that's really what we're here for this evening. Not the feasting, not the politics, not the grand tournaments and battles that castles are usually remembered for. We're here for the quieter, stranger question underneath all of that. What was it actually like to close your eyes inside one of these enormous stone buildings and try, despite everything, to fall asleep? What did the dark sound like, 3 floors up, behind a door with no lock worth trusting, in a room where you were told, quite matter-of-factly, over supper, that a lady in gray sometimes walked the passage outside at certain hours? Let's find out together. Slowly. There's no rush tonight, any more than there was any rush in that vast, echoing hall below us. We have all night, and so, very likely, will your eyes stay closed long before we're finished. The first thing you notice, once you're actually inside, is how different a castle feels from the small farmhouses and cottages that made up most of the medieval world. A peasant's home was small enough to hold entirely in the mind at once. You always knew, without thinking about it, exactly where everyone else in the household was, exactly how far the fire's light reached, exactly how many steps it took to cross from bed to door. A castle offered no such comfort. It was built to be defended, not to be cozy, and that single design choice shaped everything about how it felt to spend a night inside one. Corridors stretched away into darkness that no single torch could ever fully banish. Stone held the day's heat for a while, and then let it go completely, so that even in high summer, the deep interior of a castle's walls carried a certain permanent chill, a coolness that seemed to come from the stone itself, rather than simply from the absence of sun. Sound behaved strangely in these buildings too. A door closing 2 floors below could echo up a stairwell and arrive at your own chamber, sounding close enough to be just outside it. Footsteps on stone carried further and stranger than footsteps ever did on packed earth or wooden floorboards. And there were so many rooms, so many passages leading to other passages, storerooms and garrison quarters and chapels and towers, most of them, on any ordinary night. Entirely empty, entirely dark, entirely silent, and entirely capable, in a mind already tired from a long day's travel, of holding absolutely anything at all. This is worth sitting with for a moment. because it explains so much of what's coming. The ghost stories that clustered thickly around medieval castles weren't accidents, weren't simply superstitious flourishes added later by storytellers looking to entertain. They grew directly out of the actual physical experience of living, even briefly, inside one of these buildings. A castle was, by its very architecture, a machine for producing exactly the kind of uncertain, half-heard, half-seen experience that a frightened or tired mind reaches for a story to explain. You follow the servant with the torch up the spiral stair. These stairs, in almost every castle built across the medieval period, wound in a particular direction, clockwise as you climbed, in the great majority of English and French examples. And this wasn't decoration either. It gave a right-handed defender, sword arm free, the advantage on the way up, should an enemy ever force their way inside, while an attacker climbing the same stair found their own sword arm awkwardly pinned against the central stone pillar. You wouldn't have known any of that consciously as a guest climbing those same steps in the dark, torch shadows lurching against the curved wall with every turn, but you would have felt something of it anyway, a faint, unplaceable sense of being funneled, watched, contained, that no ordinary staircase in an ordinary house ever quite produced. The chamber itself, when you finally reach it, might surprise you with how sparse it feels compared to the grand hall you pass through below. A bed, heavy and curtained, the curtains themselves not for privacy in the modern sense, but for genuine practical warmth, closing you into a small, dark, insulated pocket of air within the much larger, much colder room. A chest for whatever belongings you carried. Perhaps a single high, narrow window, more slit than window really, letting in a thin blade of night air and almost no light at all once the sun was fully down. A small brazier, or a modest fire, if you were a guest of some importance, doing its best against a room built, again, for defense rather than comfort. Its stone walls several feet thick in places, holding the cold the same patient way they held everything else. And a tapestry, quite possibly, hung against the wall nearest the bed. Not merely decorative, though it was certainly handsome, but functional in a very direct way. A woven barrier between the sleeper and the bare, damp stone behind it, cutting the worst of the chill and, in the flickering firelight, giving the room's shadows something to move across. This last detail matters more than it might seem. A tapestry lit only by a dying fire does not hang perfectly still. Threads catch drafts, moving through a castle's countless gaps and joints. Woven figures, hunting scenes, biblical stories, the deeds of some ancestor seem, in that low, shifting light, to lean, to turn, to almost step forward from the wall itself. You will understand, by the time we're through tonight, exactly how many ghost stories, in exactly how many castles across Europe, trace their very first sighting back to precisely this: a tired traveler, alone in an unfamiliar room, watching a tapestry breathe in firelight, certain, for one long cold moment, that something in the weave had moved. You are, of course, not entirely alone in this vast building, even in the deepest hours of the night, and it's worth understanding who else was awake around you, because the presence of these unseen, wakeful people shaped the whole sonic texture of a castle at night. A castle of any real size kept some form of watch through every hour of darkness, much as the village night watch we spoke of before did for a smaller community, but scaled up to the far greater seriousness of defending a lord's household and holdings. Guards walk the battlements above you, their footsteps sometimes faintly audible through stone and floor. If your chamber happened to sit near an outer wall, their occasional low exchange of words, carrying strangely on the wind in a way that could, to a half-asleep ear 3 floors below, sound like voices in a much closer, much emptier room. A porter kept watch near the gatehouse. Servants tended fires that could not be allowed to go fully out, moved quietly through kitchens and storerooms preparing for the following day. And it was this constant, low hum of unseen human activity, present but never quite visible, never quite explainable at a glance, that gave castle nights their particular unsettled character. A cottage at night was either occupied by people you could name and account for, or it was properly, fully empty and quiet. A castle at night was never fully either. There was always, somewhere beyond your chamber door, someone moving, someone awake, someone whose footsteps, or voice, or closing door you might catch a fragment of without ever being able to place its source. Chaplains, too, held their own particular relationship with the castle's night hours. Many great households maintained the practice of the night office, a set of prayers recited at specific hours through the dark, sometimes including the deep middle of the night hour called matins, which meant that somewhere in the castle's chapel, candles were often lit and voices raised in quiet prayer at exactly the hour folk belief across Europe considered most dangerous, most thin, most likely to invite the attention of whatever moved unseen through the world. Guests lying awake, hearing that distant murmur of prayer drifting up some stairwell or along some corridor, might take real comfort from it. A reminder that the household's spiritual defenses, like its physical ones, never fully slept. Now let's turn to the question you've likely been waiting for since we began. What exactly were medieval people afraid might be sharing that castle with them once the torches burned low? Castles across an enormous span of medieval and early modern folklore developed reputations for particular kinds of haunting that differed in character from the quieter household spirits we discussed in our last evening together. A cottage's spirit was usually intimate, domestic, tied closely to the hearth and the family living around it. A castle's ghost tended, by contrast, to be tied to history, to specific people, specific deaths, specific griefs and grievances that had unfolded within those very walls, sometimes generations before the current occupants had ever arrived. The White Lady is perhaps the most widespread and enduring of these castle apparitions, reported across an extraordinary number of European strongholds, from Germany through Bohemia and into the British Isles, so consistently that it functioned almost as a recognized category of haunting, rather than a single specific story. She was most often understood as the spirit of a noblewoman connected to the castle's own family line, dressed in pale or white clothing, sometimes glimpsed walking a particular corridor or standing at a particular window, her appearance widely believed to foretell a death within the household, most often the death of its lord, arriving as a kind of solemn warning rather than a malevolent threat. A guest hearing, over supper, that the White Lady had reportedly been seen the previous winter, and that old Lord so-and-so had indeed died within the month, would carry that story up the spiral stair with them, and it would sit, quiet and unshakable, at the back of their mind through every creak of the tapestry and every distant footstep on the battlements above. Grey ladies, green ladies, and other similarly named apparitions populated other castles across the same broad tradition, each carrying their own local variation on the underlying pattern. A woman often associated with grief, with a death considered unjust or unresolved, with some fragment of unfinished business tying her to a specific room, a specific stair, a specific stretch of wall walk. Male apparitions appeared too, of course, though somewhat less commonly in the surviving folklore. The ghost of a wronged lord, a murdered rival, a soldier who had died defending the walls and, in the deepest folk belief, had simply never quite stopped his watch. And beyond these named, storied figures ran a wider, less specific unease that seemed to attach itself to castles almost as a category, regardless of any particular named ghost. Castles had, after all, genuinely witnessed an enormous amount of death across their working lifetimes. Siege, execution, imprisonment, the ordinary but very real mortality of childbirth and illness among households that, for all their wealth and stone walls, enjoyed no real advantage over a peasant's cottage when it came to medieval medicine. Dungeons, where they existed, carried their own particular heaviness in the folk imagination, places where suffering had been concentrated and where restless spirits, in the broader logic we explored in our last evening together, were considered especially likely to linger, unable to find the peace that a proper burial and a settled life were believed necessary to secure. It would be worth pausing here, gently, to notice something underneath all of this. Because just as we found with the cottage and its careful protections, the fear of ghosts inside a castle sat very close beside a whole set of entirely practical, entirely reasonable anxieties, tangled together so thoroughly that medieval people themselves rarely tried to separate them. A castle was, whatever its grandeur, a genuinely difficult place to sleep safely. Unfamiliar guests were housed in unfamiliar rooms, often reached by unfamiliar stairs, in a building whose layout they did not know well enough to navigate confidently in the dark, should they need to rise in the night. Drafts moved through these old stone structures in ways that could sound, to a tired and anxious mind, remarkably like breathing, or like a door easing open on its own down some distant passage. Rats and other small creatures, drawn to the food stores every castle of any size maintained, moved through walls and beneath floors with a scratching, scuttling persistence that a nervous guest, lying awake at 2 in the morning, might very reasonably attribute to something considerably less mundane. And there was the simple, unglamorous cold. A castle's great thick walls, so effective at holding off a besieging army, were considerably less effective at holding in warmth. And a guest waking at some dark, uncertain hour to find the fire burned down and the chamber gone bitterly, bone deep cold, surrounded by unfamiliar stone and unfamiliar shadows, was primed, by simple physical discomfort alone, to interpret anything unusual that happened next in the most unsettling possible light. A sudden draft against the back of the neck, a tapestry's edge lifting and falling as some unseen current of air moved through the room, the distant, half-heard sound of a door somewhere below. None of it needed a ghost to explain it. But a ghost, once the idea had settled into a tired, cold, half-asleep mind in an unfamiliar castle chamber, was very often the explanation that mind reached for first. Given everything we discussed in our previous evening together about salt and iron and rowan wood and quiet, patient prayer, it should come as no great surprise that guests traveling to stay in an unfamiliar castle very often brought their own small, portable versions of exactly those same protections with them, tucked into a traveling pack or worn against the skin beneath their clothes. A small crucifix or a scrap of blessed cloth, carried specifically for exactly this kind of uncertain night away from home. A short prayer, murmured quietly at the chamber door before settling into an unfamiliar bed, tracing the same old familiar sign of the cross that had marked the threshold of a home 100 miles behind them. Some travelers carried a small pouch of specific herbs for exactly this purpose, the same rosemary or rue trusted at home to guard against troubled dreams, tucked now beneath an unfamiliar pillow in an unfamiliar tower room. The specific objects varied by region, by wealth, by personal habit, but the underlying instinct remained constant. Wherever you slept, whatever grand or humble roof stood over you, the old logic held. You did not simply lie down in the dark and hope. You did what small, careful, practiced things you could, and then, and only then, did you finally let your eyes close. Castle chapels, too, offered their own reassurance to an anxious guest. Many households maintained a small stock of holy water near the chapel door, freely available to anyone in the castle who wished to carry a little back to their chamber for the night, sprinkled quietly across a threshold or a bed frame with exactly the same seriousness and exactly the same quiet trust we saw practiced in ordinary village households. A guest genuinely unsettled by whatever story had been told over supper, about the white lady or the gray figure said to walk, the North Tower might, quite sensibly, stop at that chapel on their way up to bed, and no one in the household would have thought it strange in the least. It was simply good, ordinary sense, the same sense that led a farmer to nail a horseshoe above his own door. Let's imagine now that the chamber has gone quiet. The fire has burned down to a low red glow. The servant who lit your way up the stair has long since returned to their own bed, somewhere far below, or perhaps to their post along a corridor. one of the many quiet, wakeful presences moving unseen through the building around you. You are lying in that heavy curtained bed, the curtains drawn close, holding a small pocket of slightly warmer air around you against the much colder room beyond. Somewhere below, very faintly, you might hear the last low murmur of the night office being said in the chapel, candlelight and quiet Latin drifting up through stone and stairwell to reach you, as nothing more than a soft, indistinct hum, comforting in its very indistinctness. Somewhere above, a guard's slow footsteps cross the battlements, pause, and continue on, the same patient, unhurried patrol. They will walk a dozen more times before dawn. The tapestry beside your bed shifts very slightly. In a draft, you cannot feel yourself. Its woven hunting scene caught for a moment in the fire's last orange light, and settles again. And if, in that last drowsy stretch before sleep finally takes you, you find yourself half imagining a pale shape somewhere at the edge of the room, a figure in gray or white, just beyond where the firelight properly reaches. You would hardly have been the first guest in the whole long history of these old stone buildings to carry exactly that same soft, uncertain, not quite frightened feeling down with them into sleep. Because that, in the end, might be the truest thing we can say about sleeping in a medieval castle. It was cold and strange, and full of sounds that had no easy explanation. And yet, for all of that, it was rarely truly frightening in any sharp, urgent sense. It was more like sleeping at the edge of a very old, very deep well of history, aware, in some quiet corner of the mind, that a great deal had happened within these walls long before you arrived, and would likely continue happening long after you had gone, and that whatever walked those cold corridors tonight was, in all likelihood, simply going about the same slow, patient business it had gone about for 100 years, with no particular interest in the tired traveler sleeping quietly behind a heavy curtain 3 floors up. Whatever the night held, the morning, as it always does, arrived plainly and without ceremony. Gray light through that same narrow window. The distant, entirely ordinary sounds of a household waking. A door below, a raised voice in the kitchen, the creak of the well's rope in the inner ward. Whatever had shifted in the shadows the night before was, by daylight, nothing more than a tapestry, hanging exactly where it always hung. Its woven hunting scene perfectly still now, perfectly ordinary, giving no hint of whatever it might have seemed to do in the dark. Guests rose, dressed, and went down to break their fast in the same great hall they had crossed the evening before. And very often, over that morning meal, the previous night's uncertain sounds and half-seen shapes were told and retold as stories, half in genuine unease, half in the easy, daylight laughter that comes naturally once a fear has safely passed, and in the telling, the castle's reputation grew a little further still. One more account added to the accumulating weight of stories that would greet the next traveler who climbed that same spiral stair into that same cold, ancient dark, months or years later. This, in its own quiet way, is how so many of these castle hauntings came to exist at all. not from a single dramatic sighting, carved once into memory and left unchanged, but from this slow, steady accumulation, night after night, guest after guest, each traveler's half remembered fright folded gently into the last one's, until a castle carried not just stone and mortar in its walls, but a kind of inherited unease too, passed down the same way a family passes down a recipe or a turn of phrase, refined a little with each retelling, until the white lady or the gray figure on the stair became as much a fixture of the household as the tapestries themselves, mentioned to every new arrival almost out of habit, the way you might warn a guest in your own home about a stair that creaks or a door that sticks. Children raised within these walls grew up knowing the stories, the way they knew the shape of the battlements or the sound of the well rope, not as something separate from the castle's ordinary life, but as simply one more true thing about the place they called home. So let the fire in that high stone chamber burn down all the way now, into the same soft, low glow we left the little cottage with on our last evening together. Let the tapestry settle fully still against the wall, its woven figures resting quietly in shadow. Let the last guard's footsteps fade along the distant battlements, and the last murmured prayer in the chapel below finish and go silent, the whole vast ancient building easing, floor by floor, into its own long, watchful rest. You don't need to listen for anything more tonight. Whatever moved through those old corridors centuries ago, or in the story we've just walked through together, has no claim on you now. The stone has held its cold and its silence for a very long time, and it will go on holding both, long after this particular night has ended, the same slow, patient way it always has. If this quiet walk through an old haunted castle helped carry you toward sleep, you're welcome to leave a gentle tap of a thumb before your eyes close the rest of the way, and tell us in the comments which old storied place you'd like us to visit next. And if you'd like to keep returning to nights like this one, you might consider following the show so the next old door creaks open for you without you needing to go looking for it yourself. For now, though, none of that matters. There's only the last of the fire, and the cold stone settling into its long familiar quiet, and the deep, old feeling that whatever walks these halls tonight is simply, patiently, keeping its own watch exactly as it always has, while you, safe and warm beneath heavy curtains, go. Rest now. Morning will come on its own, the way it always has.